having given that basic introduction to the type of systems which we use for observing pulsars, let me go a little bit more in detail. And as far as this part is concerned, I will be actually moving a little faster than normal because the details are something which one can discuss if you have interest on any of those details. I'll not go into the details. Okay. So we'll look at what are the different motivations of the pulsar observation, what kind of science we are looking for, and then have a brief look at the instruments which are used, and then towards the end talk about what kind of data analysis is employed for doing this. Okay. So let's start with what is the kind of data which you are looking for. The simplest form of data is just to make an image of the pulsar. And why you would like to do make an image of the pulsar? You may want to make an image of the pulsar to get its position. Pulsars are high velocity objects, which means that they are moving at very high velocities. Some of them move at 1,000 kilometers per second. Okay, so which is a very large velocity. So they will actually move in the sky, and that is called proper motion. So if you make two images separated by a few years, you can actually see the pulsar in motion. You can find out the flux density of the pulsar. And if you find out the flux density of a pulsar at different frequencies, you can get the spectral index of pulsar. And all these are important quantities to measure if you want to understand why the pulsars are emitting the way they are emitting. And most important is that you can map the environment of the pulsar. Okay. And this requires narrow synthesized beams and multiple frequencies. And since pulsars are very weak sources, a very large telescope. Okay. So this is just an example of showing the sort of flux density of the, showing the, in one particular case, showing how the pulsar proper motions can be. Unfortunately, this has not come out very well. But essentially, with respect to the fixed background of the stars, you can actually see if the pulsar is moving around. Okay. This is another example where you have a fixed background of star and you can see the pulsar which is in the center is actually moving, and that motion, proper motion, you can work out for such sources. This is an example of mapping the environment of the pulsar. So you see a big nebula around the pulsar, and in fact this is a full complex where you have several supernova remnants. It's called as Kukobura complex, and there are pulsars there. So you can actually study whether these pulsars have anything to do with its environment and how they are affecting their environment. So this is one motivation. In addition to that, most of the time, we are looking for high time resolution data. Okay. Angular resolution is not so much important because pulsars are very tiny compact sources. So they will just look like point sources. But the time resolution is important, especially for a class of pulsars which have millisecond periods and are known as millisecond pulsars. Okay. Again, you need a high time resolution instrumentation to actually do the science which you want to do. And you need a large telescope because pulsars are very, very weak radio sources. Okay. So these are some examples of high time resolution. This is a coherently de-dispersed data for the fastest or the second fastest pulsar 1937. And you can see that there's a huge, you can see a very clear structure, two pulse structure there. The time resolution here is 200 nanoseconds. Okay, so that's the kind of time resolution which one is talking about. Okay. Time resolution also becomes important in other studies where there is structure within the pulse. And this is an example of the giant pulse in Crab pulsar, where you can see not only the structure, but also the circular polarization in the pulsar. So time resolution is important, and we need instruments which can give you that time resolution and very large telescopes. Okay. Lastly, the spectra of the pulsars is important, and also how the pulse morphology changes as a function of frequency is important, because both these things give you handles on the mechanism by which the pulsars emit the radio emission. In addition to that, you can also measure the dispersion measure. which is also a proxy for the distance of the pulsar. Okay, so most of the pulsar distances are known via their dispersion measure, and we saw that the pulse arrives at different times at different frequency, and we can use that to actually get how much dispersion is taking place in the medium and study the interstellar medium. So basically use the pulsar as a shining light to illuminate the interstellar medium and study the characteristics of the interstellar medium. So this requires multiple frequency observations and a very high time resolution, as well as polarization, because pulsars are very highly polarized sources, some of them with 100% linear polarization and so on. Okay. So again, this is an example of how the pulsar pulse changes as a function of frequency, and you see that all kind of evolution takes place. So your double component can become triple components. The amplitudes of components can change as a function of frequency, and this is telling us something about the pulsar beam itself. Okay. And again, high time resolution can be used to test theories of relativity. It can be used to look at esoteric effects of general theory of relativity and so on. I'll not go into the details of that. I'm just illustrating the things. Since pulsars are highly polarized, measuring polarization is an important thing. And just as we had a coherent dispersion pipeline, which is giving us total intensity, you can actually also get 4 Stokes parameters coming out of that. And again, you need a very high time resolution as well as a large telescope to do this. Okay. And this is just some examples of that. So based on this motivation, a typical pulsar instrumentation requires the following thing. You need narrow synthesized beam, which means that you need an interferometer like GMRT spread over several kilometers, which will give you a beam size which is quite small. Say, for example, L band GMRT, the beam size is you can get a few arc second kind of beam size. Remember, pulsars are point sources. You also need a telescope where you can observe the pulsar at different frequencies. So for example, at GMRT, you can observe it all the way from 150 megahertz to 1460 gigahertz. Telescopes such as Parkes Radio Telescope can go up to 10 gigahertz. And the now sort of destroyed Arecibo telescope could start from 300 and go all the way up to 10 to 15 gigahertz. GBT can also go even higher, up to 60, 70 gigahertz and so on. So the more the frequency coverage, the more is the information which you will get. Sampling rates have to be large, and the telescopes, since they are weak sources, your telescopes have to have large collecting area. So Arecibo is a very 300 meter, very large telescope. GMRT has a collecting area of roughly 47,000 square meters. Okay. Similarly, GBT has a fairly large collecting area. So these are the telescopes which are employed for pulsar observations. Okay, and you need special signal processing like coherent dispersion, which we discussed, and you need receivers which give you polarization. But most importantly, to be able to, as we will see later on, to be able to extract information from the pulsar time series, you need to time the pulsar. That means you need to find out the time at which a pulse arrives at your observatory, which is also known as time of arrival. Okay. To do that, you need a very accurate clock, and you need to associate the pulse with an accurate timestamp. So this is what you need for doing typically pulsar observations. And different ways you can have the data organized. You can have integrated profiles, which is essentially an average of a large number of pulses with timestamps. You can have full Stokes profiles like the ones which are shown here, where both the linear polarization and the circular polarization is indicated. And you can have dynamic spectra and high time resolution profiles. So these are the typical data products which you get from these instruments which we are talking about. Traditionally, pulsar astronomy was done with single dish radio telescopes, such as Arecibo or Parkes or Jodrell Bank or Effelsberg or GBT. And now the largest telescope in the world, which is in China, called FAST. So that is the traditional pulsar astronomy. And reason was that these dishes provided you a very large collecting area. But as time is going by and all the most modern telescopes, one realizes that to build a telescope which is as big as 100-meter or 300-meter or 500-meter is very difficult. So radio astronomy has moved towards synthesizing a large single dish using phased interferometers. Westerbork Observatory in Holland was an example of this. GMRT is another example. And the future telescope in the next 5 to 10 years, the square kilometer array will have a square kilometer collecting area and would be made up of thousands of dishes, okay, which is again a phased interferometer. So there are both types of instruments which are used, single dishes as well as interferometers today. The interferometers are used by synthesizing a single dish, single equivalent dish. And that is done by phasing the individual dish. So what is phasing? Phasing means that if you have a wavefront, electromagnetic wavefront, which is traveling towards your telescope, okay, it will arrive with certain delay at different telescopes in very simple terms. Okay, I don't want to go into mathematics here. So it will arrive with a different delay at each of the telescope. If you can find out this delay and compensate for this delay, then all your dishes, which are independent of each other and which are geographically located in different directions, at each of these telescopes, you will see the same wavefront. So if you could compensate for this phase delay, then you can actually add the voltages from each of the telescope. And such a combination is called as a phased array. There are some things which are very easily, there's some part of the phase which is very easily determined. Okay. So for example, depending on the altitude of the source, you can actually work out what is the geometrical delay between each of the telescopes, okay, which is shown by this part here. Okay, so this right triangle, if you have the two telescopes separated by this distance, okay, you know that this much is the extra path length which the electromagnetic wave is traveling. And given the wavelength, there will be an associated phase delay. And this will be a function of the angle from the horizon or altitude. So basically, if you go up, if the source is right above you, then this delay will be zero, and this delay will change as a function of the altitude. So, and it's a geometric relation, so you can exactly calculate this and you can compensate for that. But there are other delays which are not so easily calculatable. For example, the signal from each of the telescope will be brought by cables to some central processing area. The delay in the cable can vary. It is sensitive to temperature, it is sensitive to various other factors. So it need not be fixed. It could vary a little bit. Similarly, the ionosphere will introduce its own delay, which can also vary, particularly at lower frequency and particularly at latitudes where India is, on the equatorial latitudes. Ionosphere can be a big nuisance. Okay. So what you do is you actually look at a source and determine these phases and then apply these phases. And this process is known as phasing. So in a telescope interferometer like GMRT, or say very large array VLA, or in future in square kilometer array, this is the procedure which will be employed to phase all the antennas together and thus form a synthesized equivalent dish. Okay. And that is also known as a coherent array, because here the phases have been taken into account. You could also do another thing, that instead of phasing the dishes, you could just take the voltage from each telescope, square it and get the power and add all of the powers together. The process of squaring essentially makes you lose the phase information. So now you are not taking phases into account. So this kind of a sum is called as incoherent sum. Both of these are employed in pulsar observations. The incoherent sum is less sensitive because you are losing the phase information. whereas the coherent sum is much more sensitive. And again, I'll not go into the details unless somebody asks me the question. But essentially, you can see weaker pulsars with a phased array than the incoherent sum. But in the incoherent sum, you can see a larger part of the sky as compared to the phased array sum. So both of them have their own advantages and disadvantages. And in an interferometer like GMRT, we apply both of these for doing pulsar observations. So this is just a typical schematic of how the antennas can be combined together. Again, I'll not go into the details of that, but you can add all of them after squaring, that is after converting voltage to power, and that is called as incoherent array output. Or you could add the voltages directly after compensating for the phase delays, and that is called as a phased array or the coherent. So this I have already sort of, so this is an example of how you do the phasing. So so here each point or each symbol is the data from one of the GMRT telescope, and what is plotted on the y-axis is the phase in degrees, and what is plotted on the x-axis is the Indian Standard Time. So in the evening, this observation has been taken. So you can see that the phase of each of the antenna is different. And then you look at a calibrator, find out how much is the difference, and then you compensate for it, and all the phases have come together. So if you are adding voltages here, you will get an output which will be very small, depending on the plus and minus sign of the phase. The output can even be zero. Okay. Whereas here, when you add all the voltages, you are now getting a phasor sum. So you will get a net output, which is like n times the number, where n is the number of dishes. Okay. So this is just illustrating the phasing procedure in, say, GMRT. I will not speak much about polarimeters, but you can also get 4 Stokes parameters from the voltage data from a phased array by doing appropriate processing. But most importantly, you need to time these signals. As I said, you need to time the period. So this is done by employing an atomic standard. In GMRT, we employ a set of 3 rubidium clocks and 1 hydrogen maser, which are 1 part in 13 and 1 part in 15 stable. So these are extremely stable atomic clocks. And the time is calculated on the basis of these atomic clocks. And the arrival time of the pulse is time stamped by doing a time transfer from this atomic clock to the actual observed data. And as we'll see, that is very important for experiments such as detection of gravitational waves. Yes,
Sir,
Sarvesh.
sir, can you please comment about the maximum detection value of GMRT, like in Jesse per beam?
So the sensitivity of a telescope, or the detection limit of the telescope, is given by an equation called radiometer equation, which I presume must have been covered in a lecture earlier. Okay, unfortunately I don't have the expression here, but the noise which you see at the output of a radio telescope is essentially proportional, inversely proportional to the square root of the bandwidth, and is also inversely proportional to the total time for which you have made the observation. Okay, so it's inversely proportional to the square root of the product of bandwidth and time. Okay, that is what is called as the radiometer equation, which I presume must have been done in one of the earlier lectures.
Yes.
So the larger is the bandwidth, the smaller is the detection limit. The larger is the time for which you observe, the smaller is the detection limit. And it also depends on how much noise your electronics introduces in your observation. Okay, so it's directly proportional to the amount of noise which your electronics introduces, and that is called as T receiver, or receiver temperature. Okay. Uh, in addition, there is another factor which is the brightness of the sky itself. So although you are looking at a point source like pulsar, you are seeing this point source in the backdrop of the background of the radio emission from diffuse radio emission from the sky. Okay. And at radio wavelengths, the sky, and especially in the direction of the galactic plane, is fairly bright. So that brightness also contributes to the noise which you get. And that brightness picked up by your telescope is called as antenna temperature. So the receiver temperature and antenna temperature, sum of that is your total noise. This noise divided by the square root of b tau will give you the minimum amount of noise which you cannot eliminate. Okay. And maybe 3 times or 5 times this noise is the signal which you can detect. Okay. Now, in the case of a incoherent array sum, you are looking at noise not from just one telescope, but from a combination of telescopes. So in the case of GMRT, let's say you're looking at 16 or 30 telescopes. So this number of telescope also goes in the denominator in that product of bandwidth and integration time. So your sensitivity is now inversely proportional to the square root of the product of the number of telescope, the bandwidth, and the integration time. Okay. So the larger the number of telescopes, the smaller is your output noise level. Okay. In the case of coherent array, your noise goes down as inverse of the number of telescope, not the square root of the number of telescopes. So the difference between the incoherent and phased array is by a factor of square root of n. Okay, that is why I said that if you want to see very weak pulsars, you generally employ a phased array, whereas brighter pulsars can be seen with an incoherent array. So have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Sir, actually, you like said that we can't measure the value like beyond 3 times the sensitivity. So, like we can measure, but like we won't be confident that it's the signal or the noise, right? It's
So
related to 2 sigma, 3 sigma, and all those stuffs, right?
yeah, so 3 times is 3 sigma.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, in radio astronomy, usually we go, so for pulsars, we go 8 times, 8 sigma. Okay.
Okay.
Till 8 sigma, we don't really consider it as a good pulsar candidate. But 3 sigma gives you 95% confidence.
Sir,
So if you are X-ray astronomer, you would be happy with 3 sigma. Okay. So see, 3 sigma, 5 sigma, 8 sigma is just the confidence limit. If you, again, somebody must have covered this in the statistics part of this in one of the previous lectures. So if you look, if you assume the noise to be Gaussian random, the 1 sigma, 2 sigma, 3 sigma, they correspond to different levels, 67%, 92%, 95%, 99% probability that this particular sample is a part of the noise or not a part of the noise. Okay. So it's a question of how much confident you want to be. And in science, it's not that you have to take 5 sigma or you have to take 8 sigma. You could take 3 sigma as long as you have stated your assumption that I am only considering up to 95% confidence limit. So it's a perfectly valid scientific statement. But
May I
you are
add
right.
something to this?
Yes. Yes, Desh.
Yeah, since this question keeps coming up, it might be useful to state the variation of the thresholds in terms of standard deviation that we apply in different contexts. The general rule of thumb is the following, that if we have certain sequence of numbers or measurements, you ask what is the probability that any variation that you see, the peak variation that you saw, is a chance coincidence, chance realization of the noise process. And if you have 1,000,000 points, then you ask what is the chance that 1 in 1,000,000 point will exceed certain threshold, certain times standard deviation. And then you would like to avoid being cheated by such fluctuations. So you say, I will believe that something is a significant deviation only if it is above a threshold where the probability of the noise fluctuation giving me even 1 point above this is low. Okay. Or on the average, I expect maximum 1 point to exceed this. or less than 1 point to exceed this threshold. And so you will find this directly relates to the data size you're looking at. When you have few number of points, you might find 2 or 3 sigma thresholds might work very well, because the chance of one of the 100 points exceeding certain threshold, okay, is lower than one. You know, so essentially you ask for a cumulative probability in the probability density distribution, such a way that above that threshold, the integral of the probability density function times the number of points is less than unity. And this is how you choose your thresholds. And the reference that Balchan made about, for pulsars, we use more often than not 8 sigma or even higher than that. It is because we are dealing with large number of samples there. We are dealing with millions of samples, for which 1 in a million probability of exceeding certain threshold, okay, takes you to a very high threshold. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, just to add to Desh, so there is also another angle as far as pulsar threshold is concerned, and that is the man-made radio signals, which is also known as radio frequency interference. Okay. So the radio frequency interference generally will be an outlier to the system temperature's normal distribution curve. Okay. So when you are looking at a pulsar signal, when you are finding a new pulsar, you want to be sure that this is not a man-made signal. This is a signal which has come from the sky. Okay. So if you do a statistical analysis, you would find that between 3 sigma to 6 sigma, you will have a large share of the RFI, and RFI is a reality of the day because the radio astronomers work in an age of radio communication, mobiles, various other type of devices. So between 3 to sigma, you can be invariably sure that majority of your so-called pulsars are man-made radio frequency interference signals. Okay. So in pulsars nowadays, people go to very high threshold. And so as Desh said, it is also, it is a function of the amount of data which you have, as well as in the case of pulsars, a function of the man-made RFI signals, which create a lot of problem. On the other hand, if you talk of X-ray in say high energies, in X-rays or in gamma rays, the number of photons which you get in gamma rays is very small. Okay. And so you have a sample out of which you have to work out the population distribution of the, or you have to work out the population statistics. So you make an assumption that this is a fairly good estimate. And again, at high frequencies, at gamma rays and so on, you don't have RFI of that kind. Okay. So given both these factors, a 3 sigma detection of a pulsar in gamma ray is acceptable. But in radio wavelengths, a 3 sigma detection of the pulsar is usually not acceptable. Okay. So it depends on the context. Does that answer the question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Any other questions on instrumentation? Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Actually, my question is, how can you differentiate between, you can detect a celestial body such as a pulsar, but how can you differentiate this body and actually astronomical events such as a collision? If you have a pulsar and it collides against a black hole, it will emit radio waves. And how can you differentiate these waves from the collision from the waves emitted by the pulsar itself?
Good. So that's a good question. So while you have asked it specifically in the context of pulsars, this is true for any astronomical event. How do you say with certainty that this astronomical event has this explanation? Okay. So I would both answer it in terms of a particular context of pulsars as well as in a general context. Okay. So it's just the mere detection of radio emission is not the guarantee that it is a pulsar. Okay. The radio emission can come from hundreds of objects. It can come from extragalactic objects, from galaxies, from far away galaxies, as well as from other type of stars and so on. So what you are looking for is something which is characteristics of the pulsar. And Devabrati must have told you in the lecture on pulsars that pulsars are rotating, highly magnetized neutron stars, which emit through all the emission comes from the vicinity of their poles, from the magnetosphere. Okay. So if it has to be a pulsar, it has to be a periodic pulsating emission. That means you will see an emission, flash of emission, and then nothing, then a flash of emission, and so on. Okay. So periodicity is an essential characteristic to say that this is a pulsar. Okay. Also, the pulse emission mechanism studies, now about 2,900 of these objects have been discovered. So studying these objects, people have established that if you measure the flux of this object at, say, high frequency, let's say at 10 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, that flux will be much, much smaller than if you measure it at a lower frequency. Let us say 300 megahertz or 500 megahertz. Okay. So the flux density or the brightness of the pulsar increases as you go down in the frequency. Okay. And this inverted spectrum is what is known as a non-thermal spectrum. That is, it is not a black body spectrum. If you look at a black body spectrum, it will go in the opposite direction. This is very different from the black body spectrum. So it's a non-thermal spectrum, and there is a typical physical process which would produce this kind of a spectrum. So when you see a pulsed emission, then you will say, okay, let me go and measure this pulsed emission at different frequencies and see whether its spectrum matches with that of the pulsar. Okay. So if you have established these two parts, you are reasonably sure that it is a pulsar, but you could look at other aspects also. Okay. And essentially, the process of identifying an astronomical radio signal requires a series of checks and a series of elimination. And in the second part of the tutorial, if I come to that, I will explain how pulsars were initially thought to be neutron stars. Okay, that was a process of elimination followed by Jocelyn Bell and Professor Anthony Hewish to tie down these completely unknown signals to elusive but very well-known neutron stars. Okay. So that's the typical process in astronomy, astrophysics, and science which you follow to identify a new object. In the case of pulsar, there is another thing, that if you keep measuring their period, the period will not remain constant. It actually slows down. And that slowing down is essentially at the expense of the energy which the pulsar is losing. If it is, say, a collision or some other kind of a process, that slowing down will not happen. The slowing down is telling you that the star is losing its rotational kinetic energy. Okay. So there are these plausibility arguments which you make to say that I am reasonably confident that this is a pulsar. In the example which you talked about, which is neutron star colliding with a black hole, okay, when a neutron star and black hole merger takes place, first of all, you will get gravitational waves. Okay. So you should have a terrestrial detector detecting that gravitational wave. The second thing is that the electromagnetic radiation which you will get in that case will not be pulsed, and it will have a spectrum which is very different than the spectrum which we are talking about pulsars. Okay. It would be what is known as a hypernova. Okay. So the kind of thing which you will get in a collision like that, or a merger of a neutron star and a black hole, will be very, very different than what we have. We haven't seen a merger like that so far, although there are two cases now detected by LIGO, which could be very good candidates for this, but no confirmed candidate of a neutron star black hole merger has been seen. Okay, but so that was specific to your question. But in general, any new signal which you see in radio astronomy has to satisfy certain plausibility arguments. So the astrophysicist will argue with some specific reason based on the astrophysics he knows what would be the nature of this object. Okay. And sometimes you don't know for a long, long time. So gamma ray burst GRBs discovered in 90s people did not have an idea about what kind of things these are till early 2000 and so on. And even now, the short gamma ray bus, there is no clear cut model. Okay. And we have radio signals now known as fast radio bursts or FRBs. And nobody has an idea what is the underlying mechanism which produces FRBs. Okay. So sometimes you can apply the known astrophysics to determine the nature of the object. Sometimes you don't know. You have to keep studying till you find the right cause or the right explanation for that kind of an emission. Does that explain the question? Or the,
Yes,
does that, yeah, okay.
thank you.
Okay, so I guess since the most of the question, yeah, please go ahead. Yes,
Sir, I have just one question. So
yes.
if we consider a pulsar, so at once the pole which is facing towards us, it will come, then the other time the other pole will come towards us. So basically you would see two kinds of pulses, right? So how well can we differentiate like that?
So this is something which I also don't know the answer, because none of the pulsar astronomers know the answer. So there, first of all, in most cases, you see only one beam. Okay. So you most likely are not seeing the other pole at all. Okay. It's the geometry of your line of sight and the magnetic field and the axis which sort of determines that. In many pulsars, you see interpulsars, but you can explain them all coming from one pole. Okay. Because the tilt between the rotation axis and the magnetic axis is so small that you can actually produce two pulses coming from the same poles. What you would need to discriminate between one pole versus two pole hypothesis is polarization information. And since I don't know whether this was covered in the lecture earlier or not, there is a typical polarization signature which a pulsar gives. That is, the position angle of the linear polarization shows a S-type curve, which is because of the dipolar nature of the magnetic field lines. And you could actually use that to determine the geometry of the pulsar. And depending on this information, you could say whether it is coming from one pole or from both the poles and so on. But there is no clear-cut answer. I don't think there is a consensus on one pole versus two pole hypothesis as far as radio pulsars are concerned.